I'd like to welcome you to tonight's program in the Public Affairs Forum at the John F. Kennedy School of Government. This program, like most in this ARCO Forum, is sponsored by the Institute of Politics. We have I think, an interesting panel tonight to talk about the recent events in China, including people who have come in the past few weeks from China, and others who have been working on it for some time. I'm going to introduce the panel now, and then I'm going to basically keep quiet until it's my turn to speak. We're going to begin with David Aikman, who was the Time Bureau Chief in Beijing from 83 to 85 and is currently in the Time Washington Bureau and has been a student of China for some time before his time in China as well. We will then turn to Mr. Hu Ping, who is with the Beijing Academy of Social Sciences. He has just come to Harvard to be a PhD candidate in government, and he will be, next to him is Huang Yashang, who is a second-year PhD candidate in the government department here at Harvard, who will be serving as his interpreter. That is, Mr. Hu will give his talk in English, but the questioning period, the question and answer, he will have translation. Mr. Hu has just been, as I understand it, traveling all over China over the past year or so, giving speeches on issues, fundamental issues of freedom and democracy and the like. And so he will speak to us on whether on those topics or not, we will find out shortly. My name is Dwight Perkins. I'm an economist who teaches about developing countries in general and China in particular. I will go third, and we will end with Merle Goldman, who is an associate of the Fairbanks Center here at Harvard and a professor of Chinese history at Boston University. So I think with that, we will have each person will talk about 10 minutes, assuming that I can maintain some discipline, and then we'll open it up for questions. So, David Aikman, why don't you?
What many of you have no doubt been looking at with great curiosity in the last few weeks has been a dramatic series of events in China involving major political change at the top of China's leadership, attacks upon what are considered by the leadership dangerous new tendencies amongst China's intelligentsia, and evidently some discussion of whether the course that China has been embarked upon in economic terms and of course in social and intellectual terms as well for the last 8 years does not need to be reconsidered. In effect, after 8 years of quite astonishing and dramatic modernization and opening up of itself to the outside world, China has just been going through a very serious political and indeed cultural crisis that is the culmination of the developments in the society unleashed by the reforms themselves. What I'd like to do in the time allotted to me is to try and set the events into some kind of context that makes it perhaps a little easier to understand than by simply reeling off the names of who has been under attack and who has gone where and which newspapers have been closed down and so forth. In any event, my colleague here on the panel, Merle Goldman, knows about 100 times more than I do about those very interesting and very important areas, and I have no doubt that she will address them in some detail. The significance of China's thrust for modernization, the so-called four modernizations under the leadership of Deng Xiaoping since 1979, has surely by now been grasped by just about every human being in the world who has access to a radio or a newspaper or somebody who can listen or read. And it is of very great significance for not just China, but East Asia and indeed the world. What I think we're seeing now in the series of events which were climaxed by the removal of the General Secretary of the Chinese Communist Party, Hu Yaobang, from his position and his replacement by the Premier of China, Zhao Ziyang, is an attempt by conservative elements in the leadership to, if not stop, at least slow down a process of economic and cultural and social change that these conservative elements appear to believe, and I think probably rightly, will ultimately threaten the monopoly of political power of the Chinese Communist Party itself. And indeed, the student demonstrations that broke out in Shanghai and then were repeated in many cities throughout China often had placards borne over the heads of the crowd with the simple words "freedom" and "democracy," words which are so charmingly naive as to come as a bit of a shock to us who kind of take these things for granted. But in the context of Chinese politics, not just in the last 7 years, nor even in the last 40 years, but in the last 140 years, are extremely significant. If we look back to what has been happening in China since the Western powers first burst in upon the declining years of the Qing Dynasty in the 1840s with the Opium War and the Treaty of Nanking, what we can see happening is a series of attempts by China to accomplish two things. First, to secure its territorial sovereignty against the depredations of foreigners, very serious and indeed at times very cruel depredations, particularly in the 19th century, and then again later in the 20th century when the Japanese became the major aggressors. That was the first objective. The second objective was to restore the sense of internal cohesion and indeed economic prosperity of the country. And the third objective of the great preoccupation of the last 140 years has been either to reinforce existing political institutions or to create new ones which could provide a basis for China's restoration of herself in the world as a major cultural, intellectual, and ultimately political force. Now, I'm not going to try and give you in the remaining 5 minutes a total potted history of China, but a number of things need to be borne in mind. During the Qing Dynasty, of course, the Western countries had a great deal of contact with China. In fact, the first Chinese ambassador to the United States was an American, which may not be fully remembered by people here. The Chinese Customs Service was started off by Westerners too. And the growth of Chinese institutions, even while the imperial system was still nominally in place, was encouraged and developed by the presence and the ideas of Westerners. Now, at various times during what seemed to be an inevitably greater adoption of Western ideas and forms in the 19th century, at various times there were sort of hiccups, and indeed more than hiccups, sort of great retching coughs of reaction against this by China. China found it, and still finds it, very difficult as a large country to absorb enormous amounts of alien and new ideas with all of the complexity and fermentation that they cause in a short space of time. The Boxer Rebellion of 1900 was, of course, a grassroots nativist reaction against both the intrusive presence of too many foreigners upon China and the fact that these foreigners were seen as causing the downfall, and of course in many senses this was true, of China's sense of self, sense of sovereignty. Now, when the Qing Dynasty was overthrown in 1911, of course, a republic was initially announced and after much struggle was eventually established. But what really happened between, I think we can say, 1911 and 1949, when the issue was temporarily settled, was that there was a great struggle of ideas going on, even as powerful factions, the nationalists and then the communists on the other side, fought to decide the future of China's society, China's form of government, and the direction of China's development. The struggle of ideas appeared to be resolved in 1949 in that the communists triumphed, and what then governed the form of China's development was the utopian socialism, I should say an utopian philosophy which called itself Marxist-Leninist socialism and had a particular variety devised by Mao Zedong. And this view of life, which had a utopian view of human nature as gradually improving as the conditions of society were changed by economic changes, governed the form of development of China. And of course, Marxist-Leninist philosophy, although it claims to be internationalist, is in fact one of the ultimate expressions of nationalism. So China sought, by adopting this philosophy, to make herself strong by cutting herself off from the remainder of the world. Well, we saw in the Cultural Revolution of 66 to 1976, or as some people might say, 66 to 69. I prefer the latter dating, but we can argue that. We saw the final working out of an attempt to force China into a new mold, politically, socially, and culturally, by essentially changing people's ways of thinking. And the Cultural Revolution was a disaster. It set China's science, education, and economy back many years. And the ultimate result was that when Mao died, and his successors, his chosen successors, kind of ran out of steam, there was something of a counter-revolution. I'm sure Peng Zhen would agree with me now, but something of a turning back in 1979 against the entire philosophy of development that had prevailed in China from 1949, the end of the Civil War. And this sort of counter-revolution, I'm not using it in the Marxist-Leninist sense, but this, let's use another term, this complete turning away and against the Marxist-Leninist state-controlled centrist view of development, of course, could only be based upon an opening of China upwards and outwards to foreign investment, foreign technology, foreign capital, and of course, foreign ways of thought. And inevitably, and this of course was foreseen in major degree by, I've got about a minute left, I understand, this was foreseen by Deng Xiaoping, inevitably these developments produced social changes that in turn began to create the desire for political changes. What we have happening today is that a very significant portion of the Chinese intelligentsia, a greater proportion than ever before, has been educated abroad, particularly in the United States, has been exposed to genuinely scientific approaches to social and political problems, and is quite unsatisfied with resolving the problems of society on the basis of dogmas originally composed by a 19th century German philosopher. Chinese have always been very pragmatic in problem solving. And the demonstrations that led to the ouster of Hu Yaobang in historical context can be seen as the reaction of a political class in China, essentially the middle-level bureaucrats, whose jobs were threatened by the rise of a new technocracy, the introduction of heterodox social and political and philosophical ideas, and the feeling that in the long run, ultimately the Communist Party itself would be superseded in authority in the country. That's my introduction.
I'm honored to be here today, and I'm grateful for the organizers of the forum to give me a chance to talk with you. More than 10 years ago, I was very worried. I was afraid that our experiences couldn't be expressed fully and giving due attention. On one side of the curtain, there was no place where we could speak out. On the other side, there was nobody we could speak to. But afterwards, the situation showed that things were much better than I had imagined. First of all, what I want to say is that in China today, the great trend of thought of freedom and democracy has its deep roots. Over 100 years, Chinese people waged a heroic struggle for freedom and democracy. This historic heritage, also distorted and forgotten for a time, is manifesting its significance more and more clearly. Under the open policy of the last few years, Chinese people have been further enlightened. However, the most important point is, in my opinion, that the Chinese people, especially the new generation, have obtained a valuable experience. Having grown up in a kind of idealist atmosphere, this generation, which I belong to, have become mature in sobriety and isolation. Our thoughts were mainly shaped by our lives. To some degree, I might say, rather than learning from others, we discovered independently the great idea of liberty. There is an important difference between this generation and that of Liang Qichao, the reformist at the turn of the century. Only when we understand this generation can we understand what happens in China. The most profound lesson that we learn from the Cultural Revolution is be sure to prevent an absolute political power and be sure to insist on basic civil rights. Someone claimed that we ought to put limitations to the top power structure. Deng Liqun, a well-known conservative theorist, was strongly opposed to this claim. He argued, although the leadership once made some serious mistakes, but it was just the leadership itself that corrected these mistakes. He thought he gave a strong justification. In fact, it's very weak. Of course, it's a good thing that the leaders can correct themselves, which means that these leaders are wise. However, it's actually a very bad thing that only the leaders can correct themselves, because this very fact denotes, first, a totalitarian leadership above and beyond the common people, and second, a miserable state of the people entirely dependent on the mercy of the leadership. In fact, Deng Liqun possibly never realized that he was giving an ironic definition of totalitarianism. I must say, I don't think China is in turmoil. The correct political situation should be described as being at a critical stage. I think I should stop here, and I welcome any questions that you may have.
Well, following on these, I thought I would try to put what I think some of the events of the recent days and weeks, put them in context, as really have the others so far, and to get a sense of how significant or insignificant the particular events of the last few weeks have been, whether we are really in the midst of a fundamental change or not, and whether China is in a crisis and how disturbed we should be about what is happening. It's hard to be particularly optimistic about exactly what has happened over these last few weeks. But I think that one ought to put this in the context of sort of what was realistic and possible in China at this particular time in its history. And I think it's well to keep in mind in that context that two things were not going to change any time in the near future. The first of those is that the monopoly of political power by the Chinese Communist Party has not been challenged in an effective way and is not likely to be challenged any time in the 20th century. If you want to get into the 21st century, who knows? But pluralistic democracy simply is not in the cards. There are not anybody really in the party that believes in it, and the party isn't about to surrender that kind of power. And second, when you think about human rights and degrees of cultural liberalism and things of that general nature, which I'm sure Merle will have some things to say about in a moment, the degree of openness to China, to these to ideas in this area, to sort of liberal attitudes, still depends and will depend for a long time to come on the particular values of particular leaders. That is, it will not depend on the protection of law, of tradition. It really depends on the particular, how a particular leader in a position of power at a given point in time feels. Which means that these are always going to be extremely vulnerable. They're going to be very vulnerable for some time to come. And that is, despite the events of the last few weeks and so on, that really, neither of those things have changed. It happens that the people now in charge, it happens that Hu Yaobang, who is no longer in a position of power, was a man who was quite tolerant of liberal views, and particularly in the cultural sphere, and Merle will have more to say about this. The people who have, in effect, reasserted their power, although they never lost it, people like Peng Jun and Deng Xiaoping, probably don't believe very much in liberal values in the cultural sphere. So in some sense, nothing has changed. But in one fundamental sense, something has changed. Up until a few months ago, even a month ago, one could argue, and I think I believe that Deng Xiaoping was different from Mao Zedong, not only in what he hoped to accomplish, but in what he was in fact succeeding in accomplishing. As the job under Mao that was the most dangerous was to be number two. Because if you were number two under Mao, the one thing you could be almost sure of is that you were going to be knocked off one way or another. And it was, I thought, one of the remarkable things that Deng Xiaoping had accomplished over these recent years was that he himself didn't even take the formal number one position. He really made a major effort to create a basis for a stable succession and to create the political base for a stable succession to a new group of leaders. What has fundamentally changed is that clearly is no longer the case. There may still be a smooth transition, but the confidence one has in that is clearly shaken, and presumably was taken either because, and we really don't know what happened in any very fundamental sense. Was it the fundamental power of the conservatives that basically forced Deng Xiaoping and others to jettison Hu Yaobang? Was it, in fact, that Deng Xiaoping and others around him had reached the conclusion that they themselves were unhappy with Hu Yaobang, unhappy with the liberalization in particular, and that they decided that they felt that he had not built an effective power base, was not an effective successor, and therefore got rid of him because of that? That is, it wasn't so much reassertion of power by Deng as it was perhaps simply a statement of that Hu Yaobang had not caught on. We don't know. At least I certainly do not know. But what then, but the fact is that the succession is in question, and it does raise then a whole series of other questions. And in many ways, the most fundamental question is what is going to happen to the economy? And what is going to happen to economic reform? And what happens in economic reform is fundamental not only for what happens in the economy, but for what is going to happen politically and in terms of cultural liberalization over the long run as well. just a couple of months ago, one could talk with, I think, considerable optimism that the reformers in the economy were clearly on top. A couple of years ago, you couldn't say that. There were quite strong conservative forces holding back some of the reforms. But I was at a conference with some of the people in the systems reform group and in the Academy of Social Sciences and the commissions of the State Council. And, the whole thrust of that meeting was really one of how to increase the role of market systems, get rid of the bureaucracy from the economic system, get rid of central planning, and the like. And the question is, has any of that changed? We don't really know. The person who actually got promoted in this process, whether for long or not, remains to be seen, is Zhao Ziyang. The man who was premier is now the acting party secretary. He is the man who has the formal reins of power, and he was by far the most reform-minded of the Chinese leadership, at least in the economic sphere. So there is, in that sense, grounds for optimism, but the question, of course, is whether he will, in fact, retain that kind of attitude toward economic reform. How far could the reforms backtrack? As most of you know, the reforms in agriculture were thoroughgoing, and collectivization, the commune movement, has been effectively completely abandoned. China has gone back to individual household agriculture. The results in terms of increased productivity in the countryside were enormous. It is almost inconceivable to me that the Chinese would backtrack on rural reform in any very fundamental way. It's not that that the party doesn't have the power to do it. It probably does. But it would be a real statement of a desire to go back to totalitarian control for its own sake, regardless of anything else, if they backtracked on rural reforms. So the real choices are not in the rural areas, where it's hard to believe they would backtrack, but in the urban areas, where the issue of how far they would go in reform is very much open. And here the argument is really between a group of people who want to retain centralized bureaucratic control over the economy and a group of people who would like to see power decentralized to the individual units in the economy and coordinated basically through the impersonal forces of the market. It's a slight oversimplification, but it's not all that serious an oversimplification from what these people are trying to do. And the people who are on the side of holding back want to hold back fundamentally for two reasons. As the conservative forces want to hold back, first, because they don't know any other system, and if the system moves to a market system, they themselves will really not have much of a role, as they've been trained to run the other system. And probably even more fundamentally, as you move away from a bureaucratic system to a market system, the bureaucracy, and that means also in this context, the party loses power. It doesn't lose total power, but it loses control over the daily lives of people in many fundamental ways. So that is the force of conservatives, and the question is whether the other side of this, which has on its side the fact that the reforms so far have had dramatic impact on the productivity of the economy, on the living standard of the people, will go forward. Now, that's the economic impact. But what is at stake is not just what happens in the economy. If one moves toward a more market-oriented system, if one achieves high growth rate and productivity, in my opinion, that is probably the greatest hope and the only real hope over the long run for liberalization in Chinese society in other areas beyond the economy. Higher standard of living will be necessary in order to take some of the pressures off of that tend to limit freedoms in most poor societies. Economic systems reform, as I've already indicated, by moving toward more decentralized forms, in effect reduces the power of the center and allows people to have at least to breathe a little bit more freely, even if only in the economic sphere, but once in the economic sphere it will tend to spill into other areas. And of course the fundamental feature of the reform has been a turn outward. Involvement in foreign trade, the involvement sending students abroad, of bringing large numbers of foreigners to China, this whole process of opening up to ideas. It's hard to, China has changed enormously in many respects in these last 10 years. I mean, if somebody only goes to China now, you'll still think of it as a fairly authoritarian and closed society. But the contrast between now and the early 1970s, in terms of what people had access to, the kind of information, is enormous. Will they back up? To staying open, the excuse for staying open largely is argued in economic terms. Most of the political leadership probably doesn't really believe in openness for its own sake. So that the future really of openness, of liberalization in the political and cultural sphere is not, as Merle is wont to say, a technocratic issue. It is fundamental to the whole progress on cultural and political spheres as well. And with that, I told her I would get my licks in before I turned it over to her to get her.
Thank you, Dwight. You really gave my speech. I guess I would argue, I'd like to take off from where Dwight left off, and I would argue that it's going to be very hard to keep the society open and continue the economic reforms while you're tightening up in the political arena and on the intellectuals, and let me explain why. I, like Dwight, up into this recent campaign, really felt that Deng Xiaoping and his group were going to do it. I really thought they could reform a Leninist state, and it had never been done before, but I felt they were on the way to doing it. And I've come to the conclusion that maybe you can only go just so far, and then you come up against the vested interest of the state. They were able, as Dwight said, to reform the agricultural economy very well. It was very exciting. The problem was, and they were able to open up to the outside world, the problem was when they began to reform the industrial economy. And it seems to me that's where they really met up with the vested interest of the party, and that's what we're seeing today. You call it the middle level. I think it's the top and middle level. And I'd like to give a slight scenario as how I think this happened. As Dwight says, we really don't know. But last spring, Deng Xiaoping, Hu Yaobang, Zhao Ziyang, all the reformers, decided that in order to have genuine reform in the industrial sector, you had to reduce the role of the party in the enterprise and in the bureaucracy. That was what they wanted to do. Rather modest reform, but definitely a political reform. So they launched a discussion on political reform, and it was truly a genuine 100 flowers. I don't think China's had anything like it since the mid-1950s, and I'm not sure even then they had it. In the spring, the summer of 1986, there was 100, I think thousands of flowers blossoming in the newspapers, in the journals, in the student organizations, in academic life, in the institutes discussing political reform. They discussed Deng Xiaoping's ideas. They also discussed other ideas, among them freedom of speech, human rights, protection of human rights through legal protection. Some even suggested a multi-party system, none of which, of course, were going to be accepted, but these ideas were being discussed for the very first time and openly in the media. It was extraordinary, and I think, as Dwight says, that wasn't going to happen. Now, what I think the reformers wanted to do was to bring this pressure from below in order to get some kind of modest reform, political reform, at the plenum that was held in September of 1986. What happened as that plenum was that the conservatives came to the fore, were able to, I can't say overpower, but certainly got the upper hand, and there was nothing about political reform in the resolution of that plenum. The 100 flowers began to wane, and when we had the student demonstrations in December 1986, that was not what provoked the power struggle. That was part of the power struggle. In other words, the student demonstrations were demonstrating on the side of the reformers because they knew that their ideas about political reform were waning, and they were coming in on the side of the reformers. The ultimate result, as we know, is that Hu Yaobang I can't say he was purged, he had to step aside, and we have the emergence of this conservative group where there's a shift in the power base. Now what this means, as I see it, is something it does affect the economy, and I'll explain why. First of all, Hu Yaobang was the head of the Chinese Youth League in the mid-1950s. He has followers throughout the whole system. They're in the central government, they're in the provincial government, they're in the media, they're in the institutes, they're in the universities, they're everywhere. Many of them are professionals. Those people, I'm not going to say they're going to be purged, but they're going to be pushed down at least a notch or two. I don't think there's any question. They charge 3 intellectuals as the main culprits. They're becoming the scapegoats for this power struggle of it's amazing. A handful of aging leaders can cause such disruption in this power struggle. They are the ones who are becoming the scapegoats for Hu Yaobang. He had protected these people. He had protected them in the anti-rightist campaign to no avail. In other words, and he protected them this time, and apparently one of the parts of the struggle was Deng wanted them purged. He refused. Hu Yaobang went, and so did they. Now, what are they? There are 2 very famous writers and 1 very famous scientist. So you could say, well, these are just some fuzzy intellectuals, and how will this affect the reforms? But it goes much further than that, because these writers and this scientist really spoke for the professional community. These writers and scientists were people who urged the professional, the intellectuals, the students, to involve themselves in politics, participate in politics. They said you can't let the party tell you what to do time after time after time, that you have to assert what they called their human rights. It's a very Western concept, no question, but you've got many westernized intellectuals there. And they said the only way China's going to reform is if these intellectuals do assert themselves. So that was their argument. Many other kinds of arguments, but that seems to me the argument that certainly upset the conservatives. The writers, you could say, okay, well, they won't affect the reforms. But Feng Lizhi, the scientist, he's a very famous astrophysicist. He's one of the few Chinese scientists who's been invited abroad, not because he's a political figure, but because he's really a very good scientist. He is a man that represents these professional values. And when he was purged, the head of the Academy of Sciences and the vice president of the Academy of Sciences were also purged. And why were they purged? Because they had appointed Feng Lizhi to be a vice chancellor of the University of Science and Technology. So already you begin to see problems within the scientific institutes. I was told just the other day that there are investigations going on in the scientific institutes, investigations of returned students to see if they brought back some Western pollution along with Western ideas. So already there's a sense of intimidation within these institutes, and it's within these institutes, within the science and technology establishment, that Deng Xiaoping and his group really thought they were going to bring about the modernization of China. Well, then you could say, well, maybe it won't be so important. What about the economy? And here again, one of the charges against Hu Yaobang, one of the major charges, that he put too much stress on consumerism. He took away the stress on producing machinery, heavy machinery, and he shifted the focus to light industry and consumerism. But already you're beginning to see some kind of criticism of the kinds of reforms that were already underway. Several of the economists that are under attack. One of my students was a student of a very famous economist at Peking University who had advocated price reform, who advocated elements of the market. His professor is now, he tells me, under attack. The vice president of the Academy of Social Sciences, Yu Guanyuan, a famous old economist, he also was one of the exponents for reform. He's also under attack. So it's not something that is just limited to a small group of fuzzy-headed intellectuals. It really is affecting the very people you need to bring about the economic modernization. So that I guess the point I'm trying to make in response to Dwight, and he could have guessed I would have made it, is that economic reforms are really tied in with the way you treat your intellectuals, and they're tied in with your political system. And if you cut back in one area, it's going to affect another area. There are many more things I can say, but I think we should open up this up to questions. I'd like to conclude, however, by saying I hope this is what Lenin called 2 steps forward, reforms, 1 step back, and then 2 steps forward again. I'm not sure. I'm not sure this is a pause, it's a retreat, and they're going to move forward again. I think inevitably they will move forward again, but what will be the damage that will be caused, and will they have to start all over again? And That I don't know.
Okay, on that note, we open it up to questions from the audience. I guess what the procedure is to go to the microphones, and if those of you, there are microphones on either side and also up on the balconies there, and for those of you, anybody who feels so moved can go to the... sir.
Thank you. I was wondering, on the economic aspects of this, one group that is often talked about when the benefits of the new reforms are mentioned is peasantry, but the political and economic response or activity of the peasantry is often not talked about when we get into periods like this. My impression is that however passive the peasantry learned to be during the 25, 30 years, first 30 years of the regime, that currently they're rather astute and pay fairly careful attention to information that they get from newspapers and journals, and interpret it in terms of economic implications for themselves. Now, I may be misinformed, but that's my impression. My question is, first of all, is this also your impression in terms of the awareness of the peasantry? And secondly, what does this mean in terms of development of the rural economy? The point that was made a short time ago about consumerism being criticized, I think could also be considered a reflection of the lack of trust, or lack of willingness to trust in the long-term continuation of the favorable economic circumstances that the peasants are in at the moment. If that is true, certainly one would think that the current situation is going to worsen the long-term prospects, at least in the minds of the peasantry. Therefore, one would expect to see even less interest in investing in equipment that will increase productivity, and more attempts to get consumer items as fast as possible in light of a lack of confidence in the future. So
Yeah, fine.
I'd be interested in your reaction.
David?
Interesting question. Foreigners who are living in Peking and have lived there for several years are much more confident than those of us who are not living there that this current retrenchment is merely a hiccup. The reason they say this is that China's economy, particularly a major part of her industrial development and her technological development within the 5-year plans, is so tightly woven into the importation of certain kinds of technology and the development of certain areas of industry that only outside assistance can help China to do, that China simply cannot afford to go away from the path of economic reforms. In short, the economic progress that has been made is predicated on further economic progress. There are certain things that simply cannot be changed without such a cataclysmic political development that what we would be seeing in effect would be a new cultural revolution. And just one illustration. During the spiritual pollution campaign in China, for those of you who may not be familiar with this term, in 1983, there was a somewhat similar attack upon what they call bourgeois liberalism. They called it spiritual pollution. In practice, that meant anything from wearing hair in the wrong way to listening to disco music, pornography, and even going to church. And there was a big attack. People thought the reforms were under threat. China was stopping the four modernizations. Not a bit of it. After a few weeks of this, the order came down from the State Council and the Central Committee spiritual pollution campaign is absolutely not to be taken into the countryside. Why? Because the peasants, being much more intelligent than most intellectuals, realized that if that happened, somebody would be taking their land away again. Not, they didn't own the land, but the land that they farmed. So I'm much more confident, perhaps, than my colleagues, that this is not a major step back. And one of the reasons is the success of the economic reforms has been such that it would be a national disaster for China to go back to a different way of economics.
Oh, yes, up front.
I'd like to follow up on that question and ask any member of the panel to discuss what they think the future of American trade with China would be in light of the changes going on in the industrial sector. You said that the agrarian reforms are probably not going to be altered very much in light of the fact that there's the potential for variety of change in the industrial sector. What does that imply towards trade with America?
I guess that's for me to answer try. The direct impact on trade with the U.S. is probably in the short run extremely small, if measurable in any meaningful sense. Because at the moment we don't really know what the impact on any economic reforms in anything. Yes, some economists are being criticized, but some of the criticism is coming from people who have said these things for a long time. I mean, I have the calligraphy of an economist on my wall in my office here, which is of a man who has been quoted recently attacking market-oriented reforms. Well, he was attacking market-oriented reforms 8 or 10 years ago as well. He never believed in them. And now, then you have to get into a question, why are they quoting him in the paper at this point? But they quoted him sometimes in the past, too. So at the moment, there's been very little concrete change. And I remind you, the man who has the number one formal position is the man who's most identified with the economic reforms, Zhao Ziyang. Clearly, opening up to the outside world in broad terms is one of the things that is implicitly under attack and to some degree explicitly under attack. It is the side effects of that opening up, however, that are under attack, not the actual trade itself. And and if you want to get into Chinese history, I mean, there's a long tradition in China of trying to get Western technology without the rest of what goes with it. And what you're seeing in some sense is a continuation of that. They still want the Western technology. They still want the trade with the U.S., but they're getting things with it that some people in the party actively don't like. And this has been a dilemma that they've gone back and forth on now for 100 years.
Can I say something to that? Yeah. May I? Or Hoping, do you want to? Let me address myself again to Dwight. One of the charges now is that these intellectuals went out for all-out Westernization. What they meant was that they accepted some Western values, some Western political ideas, some Western philosophy. They say, we want Western technology and science, but we don't want all these other ideas. Well, there's no way you can do that, because once you let in the science and technology, you're going to let in the other ideas. So there's just no way to be able to discriminate between one and the other. So it seems to me that that's rather unrealistic. But that is the argument right now. And secondly, to get back to Dwight's point about Zhao Ziyang, yes, he is General Secretary, but Zhao Ziyang has very little power. Hu Yaobang had power. He had power in the party. He had power in the Chinese Youth League. And look what they did to him. Deng Xiaoping has power. The conservatives have power. But Zhao Ziyang is kind of floating on top of these people without any real power base. And I would agree with Dwight. It's fortunate he's there. I think he's trying to contain the campaign. He just made a very interesting speech the other day in which he says we must not allow the campaign to go beyond the party. But the party has 44 million people in it. That's quite a few people. He also said, we must not let it go beyond the political ideological realm. Well, in the People's Republic of China, everything's ideological and political. So it's very hard to keep something like that contained. And I just wonder if he's got the power and the strength to be able to do it.
Okay, I guess, then we'll just go back and forth. Or you please.
I have a question. Can you hear me? I have a question for Hu Ping. I want to get back to the student movement and find out more of what actually happened with the students. You traveled around China for several months before the demonstrations, is that right? And what I want to know is, to what extent were students throughout China involved? It seems to me that they started in Hefei and then spread to Shanghai and Beijing. But I don't know whether students in other parts of the country were involved. And even in Hefei and Shanghai and Beijing, was it a small minority of students who were actively involved, or was this a big movement on campus? And in what way were students involved in other places?
讨论就是说，你不是来之前在国内去到处走走的，他就问就是说，全国这个别的地方有没有游行的？这第一个问题。第二个问题就是说，在合肥和在上海那些地方，是不是很多学生参加了游行？两个问题。
对不起，我就用中文说了。关于这个究竟在全国有多少地方的多少城市的学生参加游行，这个作为我也不是十分清楚，恐怕还没有在国外的人清楚。
He says, I'm sorry to speak in Chinese, and he says, as far as the number of students involved in demonstrations, he's not really clear, and maybe he's not as clear as people overseas about the actual number.
就是另外关于这些地方，就是参加游行到底有多少？这个我也不是十分清楚。我稍微比较清楚一点的就是北京发生的事情，因为当时我，准确些说就是在就今年元旦前后，我在北京，所以对北京的事情知道一些。
I'm not very clear about what was going on outside Beijing, but because I was in Beijing at the time that demonstrations took place, I had some knowledge about what was going on in Beijing and around the New Year's Eve.
那说北京的事吧。
讲
北京的事情，在元旦前几天，还有很多人在讨论这个问题，就是为什么别的地方都游行了，北京没有游行。
A few days before the New Year's Eve, there was discussion going on in Beijing as to why there were demonstrations in other parts of the country, but there was no demonstration in Beijing.
当然，很多人做了很多解释，不过这个解释很快就证明是错误的。
Many explanations were offered, but then these explanations proved to be inaccurate.
在北京发生的有几件事情，第一件就是这个，据我们所知道的情况，别的学校确实还是有不少人的参加。
There were a few things that happened in Beijing. First of all, the students from Beijing Normal University started the student demonstrations. They went around to Beijing University and Tsinghua University. As far as I know, the students from other universities also took part in the demonstrations.
不过，但是也许是由于参加的人不算太多，或者是由于是半夜，知道的人不是太多，所以第二天报纸上就登出了一则消息，对这件事情又挖苦了一番，就说有很多人到处说师大这些人到处叫别的人游行，别人都不理他们。
Probably because not many people were involved, and also probably because the demonstrations took place at midnight. The newspaper accounts of those demonstrations next day were rather satirical, or make fun of the thing that happened. 你再重复一遍你最后刚才说的那个。
就是后来报纸上就出了一篇文章，给他们加以挖苦。
The newspaper said not many people participated in the demonstrations.
但是当时后来就有消息，就说他们学生准备在元旦游行。而结果到元旦那天呢，确实他们就游行了，而且人还很多，在天安门广场。
Then there was a sort of rumor spreading around that there was going to be a demonstration at the New Year's Eve, and in fact, the demonstration did take place at New Year's Eve, and it took place in Tiananmen Square.
不过在白天就发生了抓人的事件，所以后来到了下午，到了晚上，在很多学校就更不安静。很多就大概是至少在北京大学就更多的人要卷入，表示要游行。
During the day, some students were arrested, and which caused further stir at the campuses, and at least at Beijing University, the impetus to demonstrate became stronger.
结果在晚上，他们拿北京大学，他们就很多同学就集合在一起，先是找校长，叫校长跟校长丁石孙说这件事情，就要求把同学释放同学。当然，丁石孙就说他们正在和有关方面联系，还没有同意放人。这个时候，当然学生就忍不住了，就走上街了。后来呢？当然，学校门口一路上都有很多警察封锁的非常严密，但是他们还是冲出去了，走到离学校没多远的地方，然后学校校方就派人来坐着车来追他们，告诉他们有关方面答应要放人了。不过这种情况下呢，大部分同学还是继续往前走，再走了一段路，然后学校派的汽车追上来，告诉他们就已经放了人了，就要大家都回去。在这种情况下，就是有相当一部分同学就回来了，还有一部分一直走到天安门。
Well, at night, Beijing University gathered together. Some students at Beijing University gathered together. They first went to the president of Beijing University, demanding that students arrested during the day should be released. And the president of Beijing University said that they were making contact with so-called responsible agencies, and so far the students had not been released. Then the students decided to demonstrate, and at that point there were many policemen that blocked the entrance of Beijing University, but students managed to break through anyway. And then a car from the university was dispatched to catch up with the students on the way to who were on the way to Tiananmen Square. And the message that was conveyed to the students then was that the security bureau promised to release the students. Despite this promise, the students continue with their demonstrations, and then another car was dispatched. The message there was that the students had already been released, but still there were students that continued with their demonstration all the way to Tiananmen Square.
当那学生回来的时候，已经是第二天早晨5点多钟了。这是一件事情。在这之后又发生一件事情，就是北京大学的同学烧报纸的事情。这个恐怕你们报上都有所报道。
The students those students that went on to demonstrate, returned to campus at 5 o'clock in the morning. That's one thing that happened in Beijing. Another thing that happened was that it was an incident at Beijing University, students burning newspapers, and that was probably covered in the Western press as well.
这里有2件事，我觉得得说一说。第一件事就是北京学生的游行 一般都是发生在有关方面已经出了决定，就是对游行几乎是个禁止游行的决定，已经出了规定之后游的。
2 points. There are 2 points that I want to make clear. The first one is that the demonstrations that took place in Beijing took place after the decision was already made by the government agencies that effectively banned demonstrations.
另外第二件事呢，就是说，因为整个这次全国游行事件的自发性都很强，它事实上就存在这么一个很简单的一个问题。就是即便很多人具有一种共同的情绪，但是没有一个事件使大家在同一个时候激动起来，那么这件事就不可能出现。所以跟这个事情，而很多人认为，至少北京市政府出的那个决定，关于游行的决定，就刚好起了这么一个作用。
Because the student demonstrations across the country were very spontaneous, therefore there's one thing that there's one simple point that should be made, which is although the student were emotionally charged, but if there was no single incident that would spark the students' emotions, maybe the demonstrations would not have taken place. And in fact, the Beijing government's decision to ban the student demonstrations effectively served as that as the catalyst.
Oh, thank you. Next.
I have a question about one of the implications of the changes that have occurred over the last several months, and that is regarding the students from China that have come here and studied and in the process have not only picked up Western ideas, but many an interest in Western culture, a love of rock music or whatever. What is the implication for these students in terms of the changes that are occurring now, the ones that are currently studying here and the ones that have already returned to China for their future in China?
Who wants to take a trial? A great many of them are in the audience, so they probably have a better sense than we do, but I don't. So.
I can just tell you what some of my students have told me. They're sure not going to go back in the near future. One told me he thought maybe in 5 years he'd return. I think my sense is that, again, that's another thing that's going to undermine the reforms, because these students are the ones that the government is relying on to help with the reforms, and if they're reluctant to go back, then you're not going to get that trained manpower that you really need. So my sense is that it must have an intimidating effect. Now, I might be wrong, and maybe the people who tell me that because they expect me to think that. But I have yet to find one student who hasn't been a student that I've had that hasn't been upset by it and will not go back right now. At least they're going to wait and see what happens.
I don't feel qualified to speak for how the students, and there are plenty of them here who, one way or another, could speak for themselves. What seems to me what has happened over the past few months maybe, though mostly, is a dose of reality that undoubtedly is going to shake anybody who has to contemplate going back. And most of them weren't going to go back right now anyway. Most of them are still in the middle of their studies. Anybody going back has to consider, will the kind of training that they've gotten be useful? And that varies enormously on the kind of training they're getting. Will the system allow them to come back? There's no evidence at this moment that there will be an attempt to not to use that. But we don't know, and the students don't know. And right now there is a writers' camp. We don't even know how long this campaign is going to go on. We don't know whether it's a 1-month wonder. It's clearly more than that. Losing Hu Yaobang clearly means it's more significant than that. But whether it's going to be a sort of a fundamental campaign that sweeps through the party. And I mean, I think Merle gave one version of what is clearly possible. If that happens, then large numbers of people will not want to go back, and that will have implications for the reforms. But others are not going to go back anyway. I just, I think we just have to wait and see. I mean, I think there are a great many who have already gone back, and others that will go back, and many of them are in positions of considerable influence. And
I suppose one thing I'm especially interested in knowing is, do you think there's a good potential for a government backlash against these American-educated students?
Depends who the government is. In other words, if Zhao Ziyang is in charge, maybe not. But if somebody else is in charge, maybe yes.
So it's up for grabs.
That's right.
Well, I would differ a little bit from that. I've always maintained that whether reform can succeed in China depends, well, of course it depends on the top, but it really depends on the county party secretaries throughout China. These are the people who tell the enterprises how they're going to treat returned engineers, returned students. You can have somebody at the top like Zhao, who may be a relatively reasonable-minded person and wants to limit the campaign, but if you've got a bunch of reactionary cadres out there in the boonies, and all they know is spouting Marxism, Leninism, and they don't understand reforms, they don't want to know about reforms, they'll lose their job if these technocrats keep coming up. They are not about to look kindly upon these hotshots from Harvard who go back and tell them how to run China, least of all when they're spouting freedom and democracy. So I think it's going to depend very much on different regions of China, the local party hacks.
我说一句，我刚从国内来，我的感觉是，作为一个整体来看，国内的学生的想法和这个出国的留学生们之间没有很大的区别，这是第一。
I want to make a brief point. I just came from China, and then I think the students here and students there in China share many similar ideas.
另外，第二，就做出了某些恐怕是有一些人不高兴的事情来说，那国内的有些人很多学生也都做出来了，所以我看不出这中间有多么大的区别。
As far as doing something that will make some people unhappy, there are students in China that actually have done the same.
所以我倒倾向于认为，在国外的留学生们的处境，包括将来的处境，会略好一些。
Therefore, I'm inclined to believe that the treatment that the students educated here, the treatment that the students educated here receive, will actually be better.
Okay, yes.
I have a question for Mr. Aikman and Professor Goldman. Some people within China and observers of China have raised the idea that perhaps the removal of Hu and the replacement by Zhao Ziyang may in fact improve the prospects for continued liberalizations in China's economy and also in the intellectual spheres because the pace of that reform might be a little slower and less subject to major hiccups instead of minor hiccups like the one we've just witnessed. And I'd like to get your opinions on that. Might, in fact, Zhao Ziyang, if he's able to consolidate power, be a stronger voice for reform than his predecessor?
Yes, I happen to share that view in that although Hu does indeed have a lot of followers in many levels of China and is definitely identified as a reformer, I recall back in 83 and 84 and 85, there was a real ambivalence about him as a Chinese leader. I mean, many Chinese were really embarrassed with, he tends to jump up like that. It's very excitable. And he made a couple of very serious mistakes that got Chinese diplomacy. I mean, here the Secretary General of the General Secretary of the Chinese Communist Party was censored by the New China News Agency during a trip in Japan because he said the wrong thing about relations with the U.S. And then in an ad hoc response to a question at an Australian press conference, he set back U.S.-Chinese naval relations by 2 years by being a bit too blunt. So there is an argument that Hu was a bit of an unguided missile, and to have a guy like Zhao, who's a real smoothie, running that show, even though he doesn't have much political power, might not be a bad thing for the reforms as a whole. The question is, though, is Zhao in there just as a token, as a sort of figurehead, to say to the foreigners, listen, don't worry if we kick out some of these people, we're still going the reform road, or is he in fact on the slipway himself?
Let me, I sound like the disagreeable one here, but let me say something about Zhao Ziyang. I don't know.
Disagreeable.
I don't know enough. I don't know much about him. In some ways, he reminds me of Zhou Enlai. Now, I'm sure this is going to be sacrilegious, but Zhou Enlai was very smooth. He was wonderful. Everybody was absolutely charmed about him, but he never in his life had one independent idea or made one independent move. He went along with Mao, no matter where Mao went. He was smooth. He moderated it. He restrained it. But he never deviated from Mao Zedong, even into the Cultural Revolution. I'm not sure Zhao is quite like that, but my sense of Zhao is he's a very good technocrat, which is important. There's no question about that. But he was one of the people who denounced Deng Xiaoping the second time around. Down with Deng Xiaoping, he said. He went where the action was as well. So my sense is here, I think he's, and when I would agree with Dwight. He wants reforms, but he's not going to go way out in front. He's going to stay within this. He wants power, obviously. He really doesn't have it. And so my sense is I'm not sure it's going to work. If he had the kind of power base that Hu Yaobang had, with his smoothness maybe, and his inclinations, but he doesn't have that, and he's smooth, and I'm not sure that's very successful in China.
I like to think, even though you didn't ask it of me, I can't hesitate. To describe Zhao Ziyang as being a smooth and flexible, it seems to me, is to greatly overstate the case. He is smooth, yes, in that sense, but he makes a good public appearance and the like, which is relatively trivial in the broader scheme of things. But this is a man who has been at the center of the economic reforms. He is the man who has created these think tanks of really freewheeling young economists who are and the notion that this is technocratic, sort of a narrow technocratic issue is just silly. The reforms in the countryside, of which Zhao was certainly very much involved as party secretary in Sichuan and so on, are fundamentally strike at the power of the party. It's a very substantial reduction of the power of the party in the countryside. Now, there's still plenty of power of the party in the countryside, don't get me wrong, but it's a whole lot less than it was when they had direct control over the daily lives of every single peasant in China. So that you're not, I think that I would, what his power base is another issue. But I don't have the foggiest notion what his power base is, or that of anybody else. It gets into the question of personalities and the structure of the party and where the army comes in. And I always used to define a fraud in the China field as somebody who said they knew how that all worked.
I didn't say I knew.
我认为啊，如果仅仅是发生了就是胡耀邦下台，赵子阳上台这个事情。那么做出这种提问，我觉得是做出这种猜测是很有道理的。但是如果我们考虑到整个已经发生的一切事情，我觉得事情究竟是有利于改革还是不利于改革，我觉得是很明显的。
I think if the only thing that actually has happened is Hu Yaobang went down and Zhao Ziyang went up, then your point is a very good point. But then if we think about other things that also have happened, then the effect on the reforms should be very, very clear to everyone.
我还要说一句的就是，就是这次作为一个总书记这种下台，他整个这个过程，对我觉得更使人不安。因为作为一个总书记，他并不是在党的代表大会上，也不是通过党的中央委员会， 而是通过个政治局的扩大会议。而在这个政治局的扩大会议中，作为并不是政治局委员的顾问委员，几乎是1半对1半的数目。因此，这里就显然缺少一种我们不说民主化、科学化吧，至少缺少一种制度化的东西。这个就使人们有足够的理由担心，它整个这种在最高决策问题上是不是有一种就是可以揣摩到的一种稳定性。我觉得这点更令人担心。
I'm actually more worried about the process that the General Party Secretary Hu Yaobang was ousted. I think this is something that should cause more worry than the fact that he was ousted. He was not ousted at the party congress. He was not ousted at the plenum of party congress, but he was ousted at the expanded meeting held at the Politburo, and then there. And then at the Politburo, and also the advisory committee of the Central Committee was involved. And that shows that there's basic lack of institutionalization. And this is something that should cause lots of concerns. That means the decision-making body at the highest level is lacking in stability.
Since this is a democratic country, I feel free to forward two disagreeable viewpoints put forward by Mr. Aikman and Professor Goldman. The first one is that I'm a Chinese student here as well. And you were saying that you see the fate of the Chinese students will be decided by the county level, you see, party members, and they are the conservative one. But actually, I think 99% of the returned students will work at a level much, much higher than the county level. They will never work in a rural county under a county magistrate or county party secretary. They will work with the financial ministry or the foreign ministry or the China Reform Center, and that's not the case. The second thing is the point by Professor Goldman is that maybe you said you're not so sure, who will be in the government to treat the students. I think the sign is quite clear. Those people who are now in real power, directly under the hierarchy, and now under the top level of the central government, is those people who are trained in the Soviet Union. Look at the ministers, the deputy ministers. Most of them are technocrats, and they are trained in the Soviet Union. And a lot of Chinese students at Harvard are anticipating that when they go back, they'll have a big battle with the Russian-trained students.
I agree with that. In fact, the man who took over as the head of the Academy of Science was also trained in the Soviet Union.
I'd just like to point out that obviously not all returned students go back. I hope I didn't get the impression they all go back to the counties. But I've talked to quite a number of Chinese students here, and what they're concerned about in China overall, not necessarily only their own treatment, is that in microcosm, where the rubber hits the road, so to speak, where the reform works or doesn't work, is not in the great institutions of Beijing and Shanghai, where obviously the leaders of the whole reform ideology are operating out of. But it's where it takes root or does not take root in the basic institutions of Chinese life. And the last time I was here, I told the story about the shirt maker, Mr. Bu Xingsheng, who was the classic example of an entrepreneur following meticulously Peking's orders on improving productivity in his shirt factory in Zhejiang province, and getting beaten all over the place by the local county party secretary, who got the local county newspaper to write articles denouncing him, got him into all sorts of persecution. It wasn't until the People's Daily sent somebody down to sort it out, and that was used at the time by the the authorities as an illustration of what was going wrong with the reforms in the countryside. That's why I use the example of the County Party as the people putting the brakes on reform.
Last question.
The question is for anyone here. I just wanted to ask if the debate has touched at any point on the special economic zones surrounding Hong Kong and other areas in South and China, which would provide the institutional framework for which consumerism and the consumer-oriented mentality would penetrate northward into China.
Well, the special economic zones are certainly symbolic of some of the more dramatic openings to the outside world, and they have brought in with them a number of the influences that that are being criticized in some circles at the moment. There's also, they were being criticized before on more sort of narrower technical grounds, but probably the broader charge against them is the real one. That is, economic zones of this kind are really only successful if they ultimately lead to a substantial change in the rest of the system. I mean, if you'll pardon the analogy with Taiwan, Taiwan started with such economic zones, but what Taiwan eventually did was turn the whole island into a special economic zone, and for the good of the end, with enormous positive benefits for their economy. Again, what China is struggling with is how to limit this process or how far to let it go. And that's what the struggle. It does have, in addition to that, some symbolic political power, and therefore, if there were to be a significant reaction, and I hasten to add that we don't yet see that reaction in the economy. We have to, these next few months will tell the tale, that the zones could be restricted in significant ways as a result. They are vulnerable.
Okay.
Who else, Mr.? I don't. Well, on that note, one last question.
A very short question.
Yeah.
To Mr. Aikman, the American reporters are notorious in getting out information out of the U.S. government. But to do it in Peking really surprised me, because Hu Yaobang was reported by a couple of U.S. newspapers about a week before he was actually purged. They predicted that he would be purged. And could you elaborate on that?
Well, as you may recall, when the Gang of Four were arrested, the news was not broken by the New China News Agency, but by the Daily Telegraph of London. And the reason is that the powers that be in China know perfectly well that the impact of news, if carried first in a Western newspaper or magazine or wire service, is going to be greater not just in the world but in China as a whole, because they'll believe it. It comes out of New China News Agency, it just might be the government line. But coming from an independent source, it has more credibility, and of course that actually happened.
Okay, on that note, thank you all for coming.